Note that this video is for World War II. Warfare and technology have changed significantly since. All sources are listed in the description. And then, despite the tank's reputation of being strong and impervious to fire, it quickly becomes vulnerable and blind without supporting units, like infantry. It can be destroyed very easily when not used correctly, that is, if moving alone in open territory. What counts as a destroyed tank? Basically, the destruction or burning of anything that a tank has leaves the tank useless. Destroying the breech or barrel, the tank cannot shoot and is useless. Destroying the tracks, the tank cannot move and it can shoot, and though it can shoot, it is stationary and vulnerable to fire. Destroying the engine or powertrain, same result as a destroyed track, but the tank may be permanently destroyed and is thus a lost tank. Starting a fire in the fuel, engine, transmission, or oil, the vehicle is completely destroyed and cannot be repaired at all. World War II tanks had very poor fire extinguishing systems, and if a fire started, that was basically it for the tank. So then, catching fire to the ammo. The vehicle burns, as it does in any other type of fire, but since the fire often spreads quickly, the crew have a chance to be burnt before they can escape. Killing or wounding the crew. The tank is out for the mission. If only the crew are killed, then the tank can be recovered if it is behind friendly lines. Generally, a tank crew will bail out of their vehicle as soon as their tank is penetrated because they do not want to wait for the next shot to penetrate the vehicle. There may be damage that makes a tank unable to function, and most especially, they want to avoid any fires that may have started because of the penetration. There are also multiple types of kills on a tank. Not all are the total destruction of the tank. A tank with a knocked off track can no longer tactically move and is susceptible to enemy fire, and it can fire only at targets within its likely small visual radius. However, if it survives the mission, its track can be repaired and it can continue fighting. A burnt-out tank is the total loss of the vehicle. The intense heat from the burning fuel, oil, and ammo fuses all the different parts of the tank and destroys everything. The tank cannot be repaired and is a total loss. Any disabling or destroying of a tank counts as a kill to the crew of the victorious vehicle, regardless of the severity of the damage to the enemy tank. The side whose tank was destroyed may or may not differentiate between a damaged tank and a completely destroyed one. For example, the Soviet Union counted all destroyed tanks and damaged tanks into one category, and for that reason, that's partly why Soviet tank losses seem so much higher than German tank losses. The Germans only counted a tank as lost if it was a total loss, as in it burnt or it was damaged and it was left behind enemy lines, because then they could not recover it. Defeating a tank as an infantryman. Tanks are nearly blind, especially to up-close infantry. An evading infantryman with anti-tank equipment will most often defeat a tank if the engagement is close quarters. There are many different ways in between the road wheels to immobilize it, but it can still shoot, or shoot or take prisoner the crew. But this works best on a single alone tank, as a tank with support will be able to defend itself more effectively. As you can see on this picture, if you put a log in between the road wheels, the tank will be unable to move. But it should be noted that approaching an enemy tank is very dangerous and should be done if there are no enemy tanks or enemies that can protect their tank. Another thing to do is drop a live grenade into an open hatch, but it should be noted that later in the war, tank crews learned to close and to lock their hatches so that enemy infantry became a much smaller threat. Or throw a Molotov cocktail onto the deck of the tank, and that will most likely start an internal fire. As can be seen on these two pictures of a World War II Panther and a modern Leopard 2, the Panther has its engine deck with many more openings, whereas the Leopard 2 has its engine deck with many fewer openings. The more openings there are, the more likely that a Molotov cocktail will start a fire. Even simply firing at a tank with small arms will be able to damage vision ports and periscopes, limiting the tank's outward visibility and thus its effectiveness. The smallest effect of firing at a tank with a rifle or a machine gun is forcing the crew of the tank to button up, or to close the tank hatches, and as an unfortunate consequence for them, having poorer situational awareness and outward visibility. Handheld anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust, the Bazooka, or the Panzerschreck are also very effective against tanks, although the effective range of those is only a few hundred meters. For the Panzerschreck, the effective range was about 150 meters or 160 yards, and for the Bazooka, the effective range was 230 meters or about 250 yards. But now let's talk about handheld anti-tank weapons. We will not discuss the finer details of how shape-charge warheads work. Germany's 1944 infantry division included 3 infantry regiments, each with 36 Panzerschrecks and an anti-tank company, for a total of 108 Panzerschrecks in each infantry division of 12,352 men. This does not include Panzerfäuste. Japan's 1941 Type A strengthened infantry division had 78 20mm anti-tank rifles for the division of 24,600 men. The UK's 1944 infantry division had 3 infantry brigades, each with 3 infantry battalions, each with 12 POTs, for a total of 108 POTs between the 3 infantry brigades. The entire division of 18,347 men had 436 POTs. The USSR's 1943 Rifle Division had 3 infantry regiments, each with 3 battalions, each with 9 anti-tank rifles, or 16 in a Guards division, for a total of 81 AT rifles, in a regular division, or 104 AT rifles in a Guards division. The Artillery Regiment had 36 anti-tank rifles. The entire division of 9,619 men had 212 anti-tank rifles. The USA's 1943 infantry divisions had 3 infantry regiments, each with 3 battalions, each with 16 bazookas, for a total of 144 bazookas in the infantry regiments. The entire division of 14,253 men had 557 bazookas. Now, so as can be seen, or I guess heard, from these data, infantry anti-tank weapons were very common on the battlefield. Major General von Mellenthin said, "The Russian and his anti-tank weapons are inseparable. Sometimes it seemed as if every infantryman carried his own anti-tank rifle." Yes, anti-tank equipment was very, very prevalent on the battlefield. America's FM 7-35 field manual from March 1944 reads about the anti-tank company. They are taught that premature opening of fire may disclose the gun positions and result in neutralization before the gun crew can accomplish its mission, and that the fight between them and the armored foe lasts only a few minutes and will be decided principally by their skill and moral stamina. Though this reads about anti-tank guns and not infantrymen, it shows that determination and discipline are often the prevailing factors for victory. Defeating a tank from a tank. Situational awareness is the key to success, much more so than the degree of the tank's technological advancedness or lack thereof. A skilled tank crew in a weak tank will often prevail over a poor crew in a powerful tank. Armored engagements between American and German tanks in the European theater of operations from 1944 to 1945 averaged 9 American tanks against 4 German tanks. This is just the average, not the mean or the mode or anything else. In an engagement between the 2 tanks, the side which fires first is usually the victor. In the European theater of operations, when the attacking tanks fired first, the defending tanks lost an average of 3.6 tanks for each lost attacking tank. When the defending tanks fired first, the attacking tanks lost an average of 4.3 tanks for each lost defending tank. The defending tanks had a major tactical advantage, firing first 84% of the time. The side that fired first usually won the battle because that side most likely had a tactical advantage, which would enable that side to win the engagement, and the side with that desirable tactical advantage was most often the defending side. Combat between tanks is mostly a see first, shoot first, kill first system. Now back to situational awareness. Appreciating the entire tactical situation for a tank may be difficult in that the tank may not know the direction of incoming fire. 50% of hits on the Sherman were against the sides, and 64% of hits on the T-34 were against the sides. Though a tank may identify the origin of shots coming in at the tank's side, the tank's attention will most likely be straight ahead at first. An anti-tank gunner or an enemy tank in a concealed position likely will be able to shoot several rounds before the tank under fire recognizes the origin and returns fire. The commander of the tank under fire may not immediately see the incoming shells and therefore may take longer to respond with rounds of its own. American tank shells and shells from the 17-pounder used a propellant that gave off a bright flash when the gun fired, and German shells used a propellant that gave off a much dimmer light when the gun fired. The German tanks had a tactical advantage in this aspect of tank combat because they were able to spot Allied tanks much more easily than the Allied tanks could spot the German tanks. The extent of this advantage is unknown to me, but it certainly was present during the war. For the same reason that American tankers identified most enemy armored fighting vehicles as Tigers, tankers did not aim for weak spots in the enemy's armor. Combat distances were several hundred meters, and making out more than the silhouette of a tank was on the verge of impossibility. Here on the screen is a chart for the percentages of tank combat distances on the Eastern Front. Note that it is by the caliber of gun and by distance. It does not differentiate between anti-tank guns and tanks, because finding accurate numbers on tank kills with differentiation between AT guns and tanks is difficult. There are common guns and calibers between the two, so looking back at destroyed tanks reveals only what shell caliber was used. I suspect that the numbers on distance were obtained by the tank crew's word. The key to winning engagements is being aware of the surrounding environment and focusing on the biggest threats, like anti-tank guns and other tanks. Obtaining the ability to do so takes time and learning through experience, of which both are unobtainable through training. There is no good in having a powerful tank if it is to be destroyed by a weaker tank before realizing the situation. As stated previously, there is a large but not all-encompassing see first, hit first, kill first system in tank combat, and numbers will prevail. Now let's move on to tank losses. In the area around Normandy, 90% of hits against Shermans in British use were 75mm guns, stuff found on Panthers and Pak 40s and Stugs and Panzer IVs and the like. 88mm guns accounted for the majority of the remainder. In 1944, in the European theater of operation, 50.2% of American tank losses were attributed to gunfire, 75mm and 88mm guns. The rest is made up of mines, mechanical issues, shaped charge warheads like the Panzerschreck and the Panzerfaust, and mechanical and miscellaneous means of destructions like mortars. In that same year, 1944, in the European theater of operation, 59.2% of British losses were attributed to gunfire. Britain was able to discover data on enemy anti-tank guns, attributing to them 22.7% of British tank losses in the European theater of operations, 16% in Italy, and 14% in North Africa. They attributed to enemy tanks 14.5% of British tank losses in the ETO, 12% in Italy, and 38.2% in North Africa. They attributed to enemy tank destroyers 24.4% of British tank losses in the ETO and 26% in Italy. Enemy tank destroyers accounted for no or almost no British tank losses in North Africa. From 1944 to 1945, combat accounted for 85.5% of T-34 losses. Breakdowns and other mechanical failures accounted for 12%, and miscellaneous means of destruction accounted for the remainder. After hearing von Mellenthin's quote about Soviet anti-tank rifles, I shall assume that they knocked out a sizable amount of lighter German armored fighting vehicles. Lighter vehicles including half-tracks, Panzer IIIs and IVs, armored cars, etc. Tanks and AFVs as a whole category are not the single biggest killers of other tanks. Tank destroyers, like the Stugs and the M10s, and non-AFV tank destroyers, like AT guns, played a major role in destroying enemy tanks. Once again, all sources are listed in the description.